Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a classic question in cognitive science, which is what makes humans unique? And this is a classic question, not just in the sense of like people have been asking it a long time, but in the sense that it kind of goes all the way back to ancient Greece. So if we go back to ancient Greece, we find Aristotle, who had an answer to this question. He thought that what makes humans unique is that we're the animals that think, right? But I think as animals that think, we might be starting to get concerned, because Aristotle, when he said that, had a particular comparison class in mind, which was other animals. And nowadays, there's another comparison class, which might be particularly salient, which is machines, right? And so if we live in a world where chatbots are appearing on the front page of Time magazine, Noam Chomsky is complaining about the properties of those chatbots in the New York Times, and the chatbots are writing responses to him, we might begin to worry that thinking is no longer something that's the exclusive province of humans. And so what is it that's special about us after all? So in this talk, I'm going to argue that, in fact, even if we develop super intelligent machines, there's still going to be a uniquely human flavor of intelligence, hopefully not a flavor that those super intelligent machines enjoy, right? But there'll be a uniquely human flavor of intelligence, which is a consequence of the fact that humans have to solve a particular set of computational problems. So the problems that humans have to solve are characterized by the constraints that human beings operate under. So we have limited time, which I mean not just that we're busy, but that we actually have limited time in this world, right? You've got your 10 years to do everything you're going to do, learn all the things you're going to learn, and take all of the actions you're going to take based on those things that you learned. And so as a consequence of this, we have limited data that we get to learn from. We also have limited computational resources, right? So everything that we do, from putting a diaper on a baby to composing sonatas, we're going to do with the same 2 to 3 pounds of neurons that you have inside your head, right? There's not extra compute that you can get when you're like, oh, I've got a really hard problem set. I'm going to get some more compute to help me solve that problem set. You can't do that, right? You just all the problems you're going to solve with that same piece of hardware that you've got inside your head. And finally, humans have limited bandwidth for communication. So one way that you could solve these first two constraints would be if you were able to, be able to offload all of the data that you'd ever seen to another person, or to, straightforwardly combine your brain state with another person so that you can solve a problem together. That's not a thing that we can do. We don't have the bandwidth to be able to transfer that much information between humans. We have to rely on making weird honking noises with our mouths, right? That's basically the mechanism we have for trying to transfer data between people, like we're doing right now. And that's not a high bandwidth form of communication. So these constraints characterize the sorts of computational problems that humans have to solve. And my argument is basically that AI systems are not subject to the same kind of constraints, right? They have, in some sense, limited time, limited computation, and limited communication, but the magnitude of those constraints is not the same. And you can kind of just see this in a lot of the recent breakthroughs that have happened in artificial intelligence. This graph is now a few years out of date, but this was from sort of the first stage of the current AI revolution, right? So this is, notably starts in 2012, right? And then sort of moves forward, and these were sort of various AI breakthroughs. And folks at OpenAI noticed that if you plot the amount of compute that was going into training these models versus time here on the horizontal axis, you get this nice linear relationship where it's notable that the vertical axis here is in logarithmic coordinates. So this is an exponential increase in the amount of compute that's being used for training these models. And often that compute is going into sort of generating synthetic data that's going to be used to train those models. So you can think about this as an exponential increase, not just in compute, but in the amount of data that's going into models. And that basically reflects a kind of contemporary paradigm for building AI models, right? This is sort of continued way up off the graph here until we get to our chatbots right now. But it's a contemporary paradigm in which we solve the problem of making these systems more intelligent by giving them more data and more compute, right? And again, that's not a thing that works for humans, right? Humans are bounded along those dimensions to a far greater extent. And as a consequence of this, the kinds of computational problems that human brains are set up for solving are shaped by the fact that we operate under those constraints. And so I think there's an interesting thought here that it might be that we want to use maybe some different kinds of math for understanding human minds and for thinking about putting some of those more human-like properties into our AI systems. And so that's the question that I'm going to engage with in this talk. What kind of math do we need for understanding human minds? Maybe it's a different kind of math from the kind of math that's dominating research in AI. So the way that I'm going to do this, I'm going to go through those 3 constraints that I talked about one by one. I'll talk about a little bit about some math, and I'll give you an example of how we use that to understand an aspect of human intelligence or to think about extending that capacity to AI. So the first of these is limited time. And I said, this isn't just limited time, this is limited data. And when we think about learning from limited data, it sort of highlights a difference between the kind of approach we might take in machine learning and the kind of approach that we take in cognitive science. So as I said, in the kind of contemporary machine learning paradigm, the real focus is on using scalable, flexible algorithms, right? Neural networks, deep learning, backpropagation, and so on. And rather than trying to engineer any inductive bias into that system, right? Engineer in constraints or things that are going to bias the system towards one solution or another, really just trying to put trying to get as much data as you can in order to train that scalable, flexible algorithm to solve the problem you're trying to solve. And so what you're trying to do is scale by getting more data and more compute in order to be able to solve more problems. By contrast, the questions that cognitive scientists are interested in are questions where we know that our learners have a limited amount of data they're going to learn from. So the cognitive scientists ask the question like, how is it that adult human performance results from the data that human beings get? And for that reason, we can sort of say, if this is where we're going to get to, instead of being able to sort of fill up that whole trajectory to get us there with data, we know you're only going to get this much data, and so we have to fill up the whole rest of that trajectory with something else, and that something else is what's called inductive bias, right? It's all of those factors other than the data that lead us to learn the things that we're going to end up learning. And so one mathematical tool that we can use for characterizing inductive bias comes from the Reverend Thomas Bayes in the 18th century. This is Bayesian inference, right? I'm sure everyone here has seen Bayes' rule before. So Bayes' rule, if you encounter it in a statistics class, is maybe sort of a relatively boring tautology of probability theory. But if you think about it in the context of trying to understand how it is that humans can learn all the things they learn from limited amounts of data, it becomes kind of interesting, right? So Bayes' rule says, if we are rational agents who think about the world in terms of probability, we have some hypotheses we want to evaluate. We have some data that we have observed that's going to help us evaluate those hypotheses. We start with a prior probability that tells us how probable we think those hypotheses are to be true without having seen any data. What we want to get to is something called a posterior probability that tells us how likely we think it is that that hypothesis is true after having seen the data. And Bayes' rule just tells us we only need to do 2 things to get there. One is we multiply that prior probability by a likelihood that tells us how probable it is we'd see those data if that hypothesis were true. And then the other is we just normalize this, summing over the space of all hypotheses, exactly the same quantity, so that these probabilities end up summing to 1, right? So again, from the perspective of probability theory, not super interesting. From the perspective of cognitive science, this is very nice because if we look on the right-hand side here and we think about learning as the kind of problem that we could characterize as having some hypotheses that we want to evaluate using data, there's only one term on the right-hand side that has data in it, which is this likelihood term. And there's this other term, the prior distribution, which captures everything else that the learner knows, right? And so if we want to be able to identify the inductive biases that help humans to fill up that gap, which is left by not having enough data, Bayesian inference is actually a good tool for letting us do that because we can express those inductive biases in terms of prior probability distributions over hypotheses. And so this sets up a research program of going off and trying to characterize, well, what are the kinds of prior probability distributions we need to use in order to be able to capture the kinds of inferences that human beings make from the limited amounts of data that they observe. If you want to read more about that research program, we have a book that is literally, it's about to hit the bookshelves now, called Bayesian Models of Cognition, Reverse Engineering the Mind. And it's like 600 pages of sort of explaining how all of that works and applying it in various different settings. What I'm going to focus on, though, for this part of the talk is not sort of showing you how we can use this to characterize people's inductive biases, but rather asking the question of how to reconcile this perspective with the kind of machine learning perspective that I was outlining, the one that's based on using deep learning and so on. And so the idea is, can we characterize how it is to put those kinds of human-like prior distributions into something like a deep neural network? So we've heard a lot about learning and a lot about neural networks, right? This is the sort of setup. You have a task you want to perform. You have some loss function that tells you how well you're performing that task. You make a neural network, which is going to learn to perform that task. That neural network has some weights, which are parameters that sort of allow it to solve that problem that are selected in order to minimize that loss. The way that we're going to put prior distributions into these neural networks is by using a method called meta-learning. And in meta-learning, we imagine exactly this same setup, but now instead of just having one task, we've got a bunch of different kinds of tasks that we want to perform. And so each of those tasks is associated with some loss. We're going to have a set of neural networks that are performing those tasks. Those neural networks are going to learn weights based on those losses. But the critical thing is that we're going to assume that those neural networks have some shared hyperparameters, and we're going to optimize those shared hyperparameters in order to let them do the best job they can of learning to perform those tasks. And in this case, the shared hyperparameters I'm going to talk about correspond to the initial weights that are given to these neural networks. So in this setting, all of these neural networks are going to be given exactly the same initial weights, and then they're going to learn away from those weights by optimizing, trying to minimize this loss. So this approach to meta-learning is something that's called model-agnostic meta-learning. And so the way to think about it is we can define a global loss function on those initial weights, which corresponds to the sum across all of the tasks we're going to perform of the losses that we have on those tasks for starting with those initial weights and then taking some number of gradient steps away from those initial weights, right? So we're doing our sort of neural network gradient descent to minimize the task-specific loss. And so we have an inner loop, which is optimizing the task-specific loss, and then an outer loop, which is optimizing this initialization parameter in order to end up with a model which is going to be able to solve all of those different problems effectively. And so you can kind of think about this as this outer loop is optimizing these initializations such that when we take gradient steps based on the loss functions associated with the individual tasks from that initialization, we're able to do a good job of solving all of those different tasks that I showed you. So previously, we'd shown that, in fact, there's a nice Bayesian interpretation of this algorithm. And the basic idea is you can kind of think about this where if you have a Bayesian version of this problem of trying to estimate the weights for your neural network, you have these weights correspond to parameters for the network, and then you would have some prior distribution on those weights. And that prior distribution is parameterized by this initialization theta. And so you can show that in the case where this is a linear model, right? So you just have a linear model, and these weights correspond to the linear regression weights. Then, in fact, following this mammal algorithm gives you an approximation to the, it's an approximate empirical Bayes procedure for estimating the mean of a prior distribution on the weights of those linear regressions. And so you have a Gaussian prior in those linear regressions, where the mean is estimated via this mammal procedure. So the key point here is that you can kind of think about this procedure of having all of these different tasks you're going to perform and then optimizing the initializations of the neural network as learning a prior for that neural network. Neural networks like to end up with parameters that are close to where they're initialized, right? That's the sort of regularization bias that's, I'm going to sort of, say very loosely, yeah? The regularization bias that's associated with using those kinds of algorithms. And so, what you're doing is effectively learning a prior, which is going to be where you're going to start out in that weight space. That's like your prior distribution for the weights of that neural network. So this idea gives us a way to then think about how to put Bayesian prior distributions of more interesting kinds into the models that we might want to be using for solving these different kinds of learning problems. So as you'll see later this week, people like defining Bayesian models where prior distributions are expressed in sort of over symbolic objects and expressed through things like grammars. So when we talk about things like Bayesian program learning, which you'll see a bunch of, this hypothesis would be a program, and then you might have a grammar that generates a prior distribution over those programs. So in this case, these objects don't look like, this is not like a Gaussian prior distribution, right? This is a symbolic structured prior distribution. And so the question that we were interested in is, can you take these kinds of symbolic structured prior distributions and put them into neural networks using something like meta-learning? And so we here as me and Tom McCoy, developed a way of solving this problem, which we call inductive bias distillation. And the basic idea is that if you've got a Bayesian model, one nice thing about that is that it's a generative model, right? So you can use that to sample hypotheses from. So you can sample lots of hypotheses from your prior distribution and then define tasks that are based on those hypotheses, and I'll explain sort of concretely what that means in a moment. But you can define a task for each of those hypotheses that you sample, and you can generate arbitrary amounts of training data that you then use to define a meta-learning procedure that is then used to train a neural network. And the idea is that by following this procedure, you end up with a neural network, which now the initial weights of that neural network have been optimized to capture this world that we've created by sampling from our prior distribution. And so they instantiate the inductive bias that's expressed in that prior. Yep.
So let me make sure I'm understanding. The left-hand side, the left-hand column, I'm not quite sure I see how the concat is doing it. But somehow that's giving me the hyperprior over the tasks, is that correct?
So this is just a prior distribution on hypotheses. So this is an example I'll show you in a moment where the hypotheses correspond to hypotheses about formal languages. So this is a simple syntax you can use for defining a formal language. And then so these are examples of hypotheses, right? In that
the hypotheses, though, those are not. Is a hypothesis a task or is a hypothesis?
A hypothesis then becomes a task. So in the case where this is, say, a formal language, then you can set up a task which is predict the next character that occurs in this sequence.
As opposed to the hypothesis being the thing on the far right.
Yeah, that's right. So hypotheses are not weights in a neural network. So we're going to learn a set of weights that are going to allow us to perform these tasks where the tasks are defined by sampling from the prior distribution. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to just sort of show you an example of applying this approach to a case which is, sort of inspired by this Noam Chomsky complaining that, these models don't learn language as well as people do, right? There's a particular sense in which they don't, which is that they require massive amounts of data in order to achieve the same kind of linguistic competence that people have. The best example we have of a system which is able to learn language from small amounts of data is in this paper by Yang and Piantadosi, where what they did was define a prior distribution over formal languages, and then a Bayesian inference procedure that operated on that hypothesis space that made it possible to learn formal languages from very small amounts of data. So basically, the way that this works, you define a grammar that samples simple programs for generating strings, right? So this is an example of one of these sort of programs. So here are all of the primitives that you can combine together. You specify a grammar that tells you how you can put these primitives together. You saw this in the talk that we had yesterday, right, about program induction, very similar kind of approach. And then the idea is that this specifies our prior distribution, and then you need to do some very complicated and sophisticated program induction in order to be able to induce what's the right program to actually capture the content of a particular formal language, or a particular sequence of strings to hypothesize the right formal language. But if you do that, you can end up with a model which is able to learn to predict the next character in a sequence from relatively small amounts of data, right? So this is just sort of showing that you can do this where, given 10 samples of strings from a formal language, you can get an F score of 0.75, and if you get to 100, then you're sort of almost getting perfect performance. And this is notably different from sort of standard kinds of neural networks that are trained on solving this problem. So if you train a long short-term memory network or a transformer, you get similar results. You get something like this, right, where it requires, in this case, more like 1,000 training examples in order to get to this sort of same perfect level of performance, and more like 500 to get to the point where the Bayesian model can get after 10. So this is a good sort of illustration of the benefit that the inductive bias gives you by having defined this sort of prior distribution over these structured programs for producing strings. You're able to significantly reduce the amount of data that you need in order to train the system.
I wonder about the neural or biological plausibility of this approach.
Yeah, I do too.
Okay.
So I mean, other people will talk more about program induction. I don't think about this kind of model as a process model of any kind. It's really what we call a computational level model, right? So what it's doing here is specifying the inductive bias that you need, and then that's a sort of claim about what that inductive bias is rather than a claim about how the problem's solved. Although other folks here might make different kinds of arguments about that.
So two questions related. So the red line here, is that using the real Bayesian method, or is this using your neural network?
No, that's using real Bayes so far.
Do you know what the gap is?
What the what?
Between using the neural. Wait, so they said this is using.
This is real Bayes.
Oh, the real Bayes. So you have not done the neural network.
So one important thing to point out here is this is extremely computationally intensive. So solving this for a single formal language takes anywhere from several minutes to a week, right? So it can be very computationally costly to do that kind of inference. Yeah.
And the other question, if you say you're not interested with process, only with the computational method, then what's wrong with just saying I'm going to solve the base? Like, what do you get from the fact that it's representable by a neural net if you care about the process?
So that's where you do get a more plausible sort of story about how it is that minds and brains could do that. Yeah. No, I care about that. Yeah, I was just saying, for this particular model, I don't think there's a claim about that. But I'm giving you an example of something which could be an instantiation of that. Yeah. Okay, so we do this inductive bias distillation trick, right? So now we're sampling hypotheses that correspond to these programs for formal languages. We're sampling tasks from this, right, where now this is just this prediction task, and then we're using meta-learning to try and instantiate this bias.
So, in learning theory, there is a result that says you cannot learn a class of languages just with positive examples.
Yep.
And I'm wondering whether this Bayesian prior and this bias allows you to get a learnability theorem just from.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's the kind of thing you could ask Steve Piantadosi about. I mean, there are also positive learnability results for the case where, so this is critically, it's the friendliest learnability case, right, which is where you're getting samples that are generated stochastically from the language and where you know what the distribution of languages that's being generated from is. And so for those kinds of cases, like Horning proved, you can get positive learnability results. Yeah.
How many tasks do you consider, and could you give us some examples? So, because it's not just next word prediction, obviously.
No, in this case it is. It's just next character prediction in the string.
So it's one task?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one task, but many different languages that you're doing that for. Yeah. Okay. All right. So when we do this, what we end up with, so this is the picture I had before, and now this is taking exactly the same kind of LSTM model, exactly the same architecture as the previous one. We call this a prior trained model. We've instantiated that inductive bias in it, and now it performs very similarly to the Bayesian model, right? So we've been able to find a point in initialization weight space of an LSTM such that remember, this is now, we're doing gradient descent on, like 10 examples, right? Such that taking a very small number of gradient steps ends up giving you a solution which is extremely close to the solution that you get by doing this kind of symbolic Bayesian inference. And I can talk a little bit about why this is different from pre-training if people are sort of curious about that.
Sorry, can you say something about the complexity of this formal language?
So these are, I can't say that off the top of my head, no. But they're, I mean, they are, well, you can see here, they're hard enough to learn. Yeah.
So how can blue points be above the red?
I think this is partly just sampling noise, yeah. Okay. And we also drill in and look at what it is that this model has learned as a bias. We can, because this is now using the LSTM, this is many, many, many orders of magnitude faster. This sort of trains in a maximum of seconds rather than days. You can actually then apply this to natural language, and you can get better perplexity scores in predicting natural language, and we can show that it learns some of the recursive structure of English, and that's what it's kind of internalized from these formal languages. Yeah.
Did you say this is, for example, at the bottom, is that 10 gradient steps or some number of gradient steps?
Good point. Okay, yeah, it's some number of gradient steps with 10 examples. Yeah, which is different. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
How long does it take to learn the prior?
How long does it take?
That's not included, though. Like,
No, that's right. That's not included here. Yeah. I can't answer that off the top of my head because we did a lot of different experiments. Okay.
So
Yeah.
I was also wondering that just as a rough, where is the break-even point? Like if I was going to, just in terms of time, right? If I was, had a bunch of
Just like the
languages,
amortization.
how many languages do I need to train with 10 examples so it's worthwhile for me to do this?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I can't answer that off the top of my head, but we can figure that out if you're curious. But again, our point here was more about being able to instantiate that bias. Yeah, and so the point here is this is not something which is constrained to just this example, right? So again, I think later in the week you're going to see using probabilistic programs to learn concepts. A sort of precursor of that was this work which looked at using learning concepts by inducing logical formulas. And so we can do the same thing here. So Joanna and Tom showed that if we take a Bayesian model, which has a prior distribution defined on logical formulas, and we apply it to a problem where it's trying to learn essentially a logical formula just from examples of labeled observations according to that formula. When we do this, if you just take a sort of off-the-shelf multi-layer perceptron and try and get it to perform this task, it produces essentially zero correlation with human judgments and zero correlation with the Bayesian model. But if we use this prior training procedure, we end up with a model that correlates with both of those. Okay. So that was the first example, right? Thinking about capturing inductive biases and then how it is that we can encode those inductive biases in machines. The second case I'm going to talk about is this case of thinking about limited computation. And again, I think this is something that we can get a sort of a handle on using the right set of mathematical tools. So this is a famous example of a AI system beating a human, although I would claim that, in fact, it's not a fair contest, right? So this is Garry Kasparov being defeated by Deep Blue. And it's worth pointing out that these two systems are not really operating on the same terms, right? So on the left, you have a system which is able to search a chess position, sort of on the order of between 1 and 10 chess positions per second, right? On the right, you have a system that's searching around 100,000 chess positions per second. On the right, you have a system which is powered by an industrial power plant. On the left, you have a system which is powered by some black coffee and a piece of toast, right? So they're operating under very different kinds of computational constraints. And so what we'd like to be able to characterize is how it is that the system over here is able to make good use of the limited computational resources it has to solve this problem. And if we sort of go to our sort of, think about this as a decision-making problem, right? Like what move should I make? What action should I take? If we go to our sort of standard set of tools for thinking about what good decision-making looks like, we discover that those tools are not particularly useful for doing this, right? So the sort of go-to gold standard for making a good decision is expected utility theory. It says take the action that has highest expected utility. This is really not very useful advice, right? So if you've ever tried to make a decision and tried to maximize your expected utility, the real problem here is that this doesn't tell you how it is you're supposed to calculate the utilities that could be associated with those outcomes, or how it is you're able to deal with the fact that there are so many possible outcomes that you could consider. And so this isn't very helpful to us. So in fact, what's missing from expected utility theory is anything about computation, right? So it doesn't tell us anything about how hard it might be to sort of engage in this process of figuring out what the right action might be. That's not reflected in this calculation. From a cognitive scientist perspective, this is what we call a behaviorist theory of decision making, in the sense that it really just talks about the actions that you're going to take in terms of the environment that you're in. It doesn't say anything about the internal states that you go through to make those decisions. And so we've been exploring a different way of thinking about rational decision making, we call resource rationality, where the idea is to use the strategy that best trades off utility and computational cost, right? So now what we're doing is, instead of maximizing over actions, we have an outer loop where what we're doing is maximizing over strategies or policies or algorithms that we're going to use to make a choice, where we think about that algorithm as telling us a sequence of computations we're going to perform, where those computations are associated with some underlying cost. And each computation is changing the beliefs that we have such that we get to a point where we're going to end up with some set of beliefs that we're going to use to then take an action that maximizes expected utility with respect to those beliefs. So here the challenge is, being rational means following a good algorithm for getting to the point where we know the things that we need to know in order to make what feels like an informed decision relative to the cost of engaging in the sort of deliberation and computation that we need in order to get there. And so the emphasis is taken off the external action and put on the internal computations.
So I get the general idea. I mean, this goes back to computational heuristics, as it's called in like behavioral game theory and many other fields.
Yeah, I.J. Good, right?
It goes back a long way. I mean, Eric Horvitz.
Yeah.
So, but just to make sure I'm exactly tracking what you have written, could you fill in just all the missing arguments? I mean, pi, for example, is not in the argmax.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not.
So pi is going to be the policy that tells you what computations you should select based on the beliefs you have.
Okay,
right?
so B sub lowercase t is beliefs.
Yep.
And B sub, what is capital T?
This is your terminal beliefs. Yeah.
So should that be sum from t equals 1 to capital T?
Yes, that should be capital T. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So what we're doing is shifting the emphasis from external actions to internal states. We have a more complicated sort of formal framework. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, which observes that you can think about this as a sequential decision problem, right? So we've gone from that decision problem we had to a sequential decision problem where now you're executing the sequence of computations to update your belief states. You can express that as a kind of Markov decision process. It's called a meta-level Markov decision process. And we can solve those meta-level Markov decision processes to make predictions about how it is that people should use their cognitive resources. I'm just going to show you a simple example that's motivated by this chess case, which uses the fact that two interesting things have happened in the last few years. One is a lot of people started playing online chess, and as a consequence, we have a huge amount of data from online chess servers. We have about 5 billion chess games. That's about 500 billion human decisions that we can analyze to actually learn things about how people play chess. And the other is AI chess engines are now so good that we can sort of kind of treat them as ground truth, right? And so those two things turn an intractable problem, which is trying to figure out how people make decisions in this very, very, very large state space, into something that we can actually analyze using some of the tools of cognitive science. And so in a project with Evan Russick, Dana Costa-Kane, Bastian Opperston, and Marcelo Mitar, this is what we did. We looked at whether human chess players actually make good decisions about how to use their computation. And the key observation here is that we're able to identify different chess board positions that differ in the value of computation in those positions. And so the way that we assess this is very simply, we use a chess engine which searches either 1 step into the future or 15 steps into the future. And then we can look at, if you take the move that results from going 1 step into the future versus 15 steps in the future, how much better is the move that you get when you search 15 steps into the future? So as an example, this is a case where searching more steps into the future is really valuable. If you're a chess player, well, so if you go 1 step into the future, you just take this pawn, right? You're like, hey, I got a pawn, right? If you go 15 steps into the future, you realize that there's a checkmate that's about to happen here. So white is able to move this rook over, and then a whole sort of chain of things kicks off, and about 7 moves into the future, you end up losing the game. Yeah.
I'm confused. So the board evaluator you're using is the same. So you're doing 15 steps in, but then you're saying using the same board evaluator as using with the 1 step into the future?
Yes, we're always evaluating with the 15-step evaluator. Yeah.
Oh, you're always evaluating. So even if you do 1 step, you're still evaluating the 15-step evaluator.
Yeah.
But if I'm that stupid, I only go 1 step ahead, then my evaluation of boards presumably is different.
No, but that's right. But we want the ground truth, right? So we want to know how good was the move actually that you made when you went 1 step, when you only planned 1 step into the
It's not a good move for me if it only puts me in a position that I have to be super smart in order to leverage it, right?
Yeah, that's right. But we're
But that's okay.
yeah, but we're making that up.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a case where there's a big difference in the value of the board position. And the way that this is translated, we actually build a model from the output of the chess engine, which just maps this onto the probability that you win this game from this board position, agnostic of time remaining, right? So this is just the win probability, essentially, right? So there's a big difference. This change in the utility that's associated with that board position is a consequence of thinking here. This is a case where it doesn't matter how much you think, right? You do the same move. Whether you think a little or you think a lot, there's a hanging knight and you end up taking it, right? And so this is a case where it's not very valuable to think. So what we can then do is look across a whole bunch of different board positions. In this case, I think it's only about 12 million games instead of that whole 5 billion, but that's enough. We can plot out under different time conditions. That's what these numbers correspond to. This is like 60 seconds per player, all the way up to 1800 seconds plus 20 seconds per move. And then this is how long people spend thinking versus the value of thinking in that board position. And the key thing we find is that across all of these different conditions, you see this increasing relationship. People are spending more time thinking when it's more valuable to think, okay? So chess players have somehow internalized, this is a good situation to think versus this is not. And this is also something which increases with expertise. So this is just showing the ELO, which is a measure of player ability across, again, all these different time conditions. The magnitude of that effect increases as you become a better chess player. So one of the things you learn as you play chess is also like, is this a good position to think or not? Yeah.
So it seems possible that like you could have a very simple strategy of like, if I see a move that is at least this good, then I'll just stop thinking and take
that's right.
it.
Yep.
Which maybe doesn't require me to sort of do this metacognitive process of like evaluating the board for like, this seems like a rich board.
That's right.
Do you have a sense of how you might be able to disambiguate
No,
those two?
so there's a few things that are going on here that are simplifying this, right? So one is we're using an oracle value for this, right? Which means that you have to have some way of predicting that in order to discover that relationship. It turns out if we incorporate uncertainty into this, which is what players actually have about what the future might yield, you get an even better model. I just sort of gave you the simplest model here. And then we're not sure if it's done sort of ballistically or in a sort of satisficing kind of fashion, and that's something that I think you need more nuanced tools to be able to look at. Yeah. Okay. All right. So one thing you might notice here is that this is not a sort of straightforwardly linear relationship, and in fact, the form of that relationship reflects this other part that I was talking about in terms of the cost of engaging in computation. So this, believe it or not, is more data. So this is showing plotting that value of the board position, right? This is the win probability agnostic of time along this axis. And this is how much time you have left in a game. And then the different colors correspond to, so each of the cells here is a tiny bin in this space of win probability versus time. And the colors correspond to the actual probability that you win the game from that combination of board position advantage, and time remaining, okay? So what you should be able to see here is, this sort of board position advantage and win probability, this is sort of perfectly well calibrated as you go through most of the game. Then as you get towards the end of the game, this is a good sort of more salient example, as you get towards the end of the game, you actually care much more about being in a good board position, right? So with very little time remaining, board position matters much more for determining whether you're going to win the game or not, right? And so what that means is that the cost here of engaging in thinking is something that is not sort of linearly increasing in time. It's in fact non-linearly increasing in a way that captures the nonlinearity that we saw in that previous slide. So you can plot out isocontours of board position advantage over time, and you get this curvature, and it's that curvature that corresponds to the curvature that we saw in the previous slide. So this is, chess players are not just sensitive to how much, whether it's a good position to think in, they're also sensitive to, is this a good moment to think? And that's something that produces that kind of relationship. Okay. All right, so the third constraint I want to talk about is this constraint of limited communication, right? And one important observation here is that, I just
have a really quick question about the chess thing.
Yeah.
This might be a really dumb question, but is the probability of winning the same thing as the probability of not losing?
Modulo ties. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So one sort of hidden secret in this plot is that this is not a consequence of chips getting faster, right? So in fact, the use of compute in AI systems is doubling about every 3 months. Chips double about every 18 months, right? So this increase in compute is a consequence of more and more, in this case, GPUs being used for these systems. So it's a consequence of sort of massive parallelization of the compute which is being performed by these systems. And that kind of parallelization is a good way, if you've got limited computational resources on a single processor, to be able to start scaling that up, right? So that gives you a way of thinking about how it is that humans might go beyond the constraints that we operate under from having a single mind, right? We do this where if we're trying to solve a problem that might require more computation than one mind provides, we do things like form a social group and work together, form a company in order to solve a problem. If we're trying to solve a problem that requires more data than we can accumulate in one lifetime, then we engage in processes of cumulative cultural evolution. We create institutions, things like science, publishing our results, writing things down. These are mechanisms that allow us to accumulate data across many generations. And so one challenge that comes up in this context is that part of what makes us good at individual learning is something that can interfere with learning from others, right? Those inductive biases that I was talking about as being so good for helping us learn from small amounts of data are actually things that create an impediment when we start thinking about learning in these kind of cultural settings, where the biases that I have are going to interfere with the learning that I need to do from the information you're going to provide to me. And so and we have some papers with Bill Thompson where we show that this actually is a constraint on cultural evolution. And so what we have to do is work out good, effective protocols that allow us to accumulate knowledge across generations. And so you can kind of think about human beings as engaging in a sort of project of distributed computation, and these sort of problems of engaging in cumulative cultural evolution as being problems of specifying effective protocols that allow us to do so. And so we've done a bunch of work in the lab looking at what are good protocols and bad protocols from the perspective of allowing humans to go beyond the information that they get in their own experiences and be able to learn from others. And one of the tools that we use for doing that is running evolutionary simulations with people. So here the basic idea is, there's a long tradition of running sort of agent-based evolutionary simulations on computers. And there's also a long tradition in psychology of running experiments that use increasingly sophisticated designs where maybe you have information passed from one person to another, or you have a bunch of people engaging in a sort of small network to interact. And so we kind of combine those things together to create a way of running large-scale evolutionary simulations of people, which you can think about as being exactly the sort of agent-based simulations in terms of like all of the mechanisms you use for generating sort of subsequent generations of individuals and implementing evolutionary processes in a theoretical simulation you can do. But now you're doing this with a population of humans who are engaging in a task, and the output from their performance of that task becomes the input that's provided to the next generation. And so one of the questions that we were interested in exploring using this technique was how it is that people identify effective algorithms for solving problems, right? So things like making stone tools, engaging in celestial navigation, or baking a loaf of bread are all algorithmic procedures. They're all things that have a lot of the content of the kinds of programs that you've been seeing, right? They have control structures and so on. We're interested in how it is that things that have that kind of structure are able to evolve, and in particular, how they're able to be improved upon through processes of cultural transmission. And so in order to investigate this, we, which is now Bill Thompson, Bassett Oppiston, and Ted Summers and I, looked at a simple task which has this kind of structure that makes it possible for the underlying sort of algorithms to be revealed. And so this task is one that's going to be painfully familiar to anybody who's taken an introductory computer science class, right? The task is sorting. So here we have a set of images. Unbeknownst to the participants, there's a set of numbers that correspond to those images. And the task that they have is putting the images into order from left to right. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Of course, they never get to see what those numbers are. The only way that they can find out if one image is a lower number than another one is by clicking on them. And so if you click on 2 and 1, then they would exchange place, right? So what we've done is created a task where we're basically getting people to rediscover sorting algorithms that you can use by using comparisons between things to try and sort a list. There's a bunch of different kinds of sorting algorithms. Again, sorry for people that this is causing flashbacks to introductory computer science. So we can set up a scoring regime based on how many comparisons people use in order to tell how good a sorting algorithm is in this setting. There's lots of not particularly good sorting algorithms. If you follow, in this case, the optimal sorting circuit, then you get sort of 100% on our task. But the next best algorithm is an algorithm that's called a gnome sort algorithm, which I'll show you in a moment. So I'm going to focus in on these two cases, gnome sort and selection sort.
Optimal sorting depends upon details of things like whether randomness is involved and so on.
This is exactly what I showed you. So you're making pairwise comparisons, and it's about making the minimum number of pairwise comparisons. And when you make a comparison, the two objects that you compare get transposed.
So am I going to do things like choose a random pivot point, or?
No, so it's just the optimal strategy here is a sorting circuit. So you can just derive the optimal sorting circuit for 6 items.
I think because it's optimal in terms of the worst case or optimal in terms of the average case for random initial permutations?
It's worst case, yeah.
So,
yeah.
All these possible hypotheses for how a human might solve
Yeah, so the reason I'm going to show you these, so these are all algorithms that our humans use, except for this one. And I'll show you these two in detail because these are the most common that people use. Okay, so selection sort, which I showed in green, is a very straightforward procedure. It's probably the thing that you first think of if you haven't taken a computer science class, where you basically just make pairs of comparisons and you just enumerate all of those pairs, right? So our human says, I started with the first picture, clicked on picture 2, back to 1, then picture 3, then back to 1, then picture 4, and so on. After it's done with the first picture, went to the second picture to 3, and so on and so on. So very intuitive, very straightforward. Not the highest performing algorithm, but very easy to describe. The gnome sort procedure is a little more complicated. So this is something where you need to maintain a little bit of state, right? So here, the description is, begin with comparing the second picture to the picture on the left. Once it stops moving, move on to the third picture and compare it with the pictures to the left until it stops moving. Then move on to the fourth picture, compare it to the pictures left. Then move on to the fifth picture, and so on. Finally, choose the sixth picture, compare it to the pictures on the left. Once the sixth picture stops moving, the picture should be in numerical order. Okay? Slightly more complex algorithm, but more performant in this setting. Okay, so what we can then do is take this task that I showed you and put it into this evolutionary simulation setting. And what we did was run a version of this experiment where people would do sort of 3 practice trials so they could sort of learn the basics of how the sorting procedure worked and sort of come up with a procedure they were going to use. They then did 9 scored trials where they were scored for how well they did, and then did a demonstration of their sorting procedure and typed a description like the descriptions that I was showing you there. Then when we went to we did that for 15 people in each generation, and then when we go to the next generation, those people can see 8 people from the previous generation, choose 3 of those people to learn from, and then they get to see the demonstration and the description that were provided by those 3 people. And then we iterate this process for 12 generations.
Yeah, what did they choose based on?
Exactly. So this is the critical manipulation here is what information people have access to when they're choosing. So we manipulated the equivalent of the evolutionary sort of process of selection, right? So whether the scores of the people that you're choosing from are visible to you or not, okay? And that's the only thing that we're going to manipulate is you can choose, you're always learning from 3 people. The only difference is whether you know how well they perform the task or not.
So if I don't, then what are you just tell me? What do I know about them or nothing? Or what is the choice?
You say, here's some people, yeah.
So what does the choice mean? The choice means, I mean.
Yeah, that's right. But we're psychologists, so we keep it exactly the same.
Okay.
Okay. And we did this across 10 different populations of these 12 generations of 15 people.
Just following up Nathan's question, so in the one case, I have no information, I can just throw a dice.
You see, like, you say, here's 8 participants who've done this
That's
previously.
all I know, and I like
just choose 3 of them you want to learn from. Yeah.
Because I like the way one looks, and I don't like the way the other one is.
Yeah, you don't, all you have is like a little descriptor, like participant 19861 or whatever it is.
Okay, and then in the other case, I'm given all 8 people's scores?
Yeah, you see here's the list of participants, and then here's how well they performed, the score that they got when they performed this task.
And so why wouldn't you just go for the top?
You should, yeah, that's right. So that's what we're looking at, is the impact of selection here in this setting.
Okay.
Okay, so you're always benefiting from the wisdom of the previous generations. There's one tweak, which is whether you're able to say, that person seems to be successful, I'm going to choose to learn from them.
Which is standard social learning.
Yeah. All right, so here are results. I'm just going to color these in terms of gnome sort and selection sort, right? So this is one of those 10 populations. So this is, on the left, this is this random mixing population where you don't have that signal. On the right, this is the selective social learning condition where you do have that signal. And then the way we've put these into a tree is you chose from those 3 people in the previous generation. So this is just showing, linking you back to the most successful person in of the 3 that you chose. So we can turn this into a tree. And what you can see is, on the left, we see lots of selection sort. On the right, we see lots of gnome sort. It's not that people on the left never came up with the better algorithm. It's that better algorithm never sort of took over the population. On the right, that better algorithm, which is more counterintuitive, right? That's your inductive biases working against you, is now something that people are able to pick up as a consequence of sort of knowing that they should be motivated to try and figure this out because that person did a really good job of solving that problem. Yeah.
I'm thinking about sort of Darwinian evolution and evolutionary algorithms that we implement, and we always make selection have a little bit of noise so that we can explore as well as exploit, so that we don't get caught. But this problem looks like you can't go into a hole and never, like there's no local minima.
Yeah, there is plenty of noise here, right? You can see sort of failures in transmission. The noise is coming from inside the people's heads. Yeah.
For the first generation, what's like the distribution of selection sort versus gnome sort versus?
You can see here, so the one thing I didn't mention is that for this population, we always pair, so we couple the first generation across the 2 conditions. So you can see here, the first generation is exactly the same for these 2 groups. And then I think we have about 20% of people maybe come up with that other, the more complex algorithm. Actually, it's less than that because I think it's about, it's probably more like 10% across, sort of spontaneously coming up with it. Yeah.
So after I do the selection, I still know of the people I selected who had high scores and who had low scores. Is that correct?
Yes.
So do you know how much is this due to the selection as opposed to just knowing that the person is teaching me is
a good teacher or not? Yeah. So we can't differentiate those. Yeah.
But I might be missing it. Well, why would I not? What's the lesson here? How could it possibly turn out otherwise?
So the point here is that the cultural transmission in itself is not sufficient to allow you to end up finding something which is a counterintuitive but better algorithm, right?
If nobody is getting any kind of feedback on how good it is, of course not.
No, but it's this person, you're benefiting from the experience of the previous person who's benefiting from the experience of the previous person and so on, right? In each case, what's getting transmitted is someone who's done 9 trials of this or 12 trials of this task, come up with a strategy they think is pretty good. They tell the next person, I think this is a pretty good strategy, right? And then that person does it for 12 trials, and then they tell the next person, I think this is a pretty good strategy. And in both cases, people are getting paid based not just on how well they perform the task, but on how well their descendants perform the task. So they're motivated to effectively transmit that. And so despite having all of those things, which you might think would be sufficient to allow them to transmit, what's happening is the fact that that hypothesis is counterintuitive is working against the fact that it's a good way of solving this problem, and meaning that it's not getting, it's not taking over the population. Even though people are sort of coming up with it, and occasionally, this is the full population, occasionally you do get sort of bursts of it getting transmitted, right? So it's not that, again, it's not that it doesn't get transmitted at all. It's just that it never takes over. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the, if you go back to the last one, and I'm seeing it here too, but there is this gray circle. What strategy is that? That's first done selection sort.
Yeah, so that's, so these are strategies that were not classified by our classifier. Yeah. So it's probably a variant on gnome sort. It's just not it's not clear what it's doing. Yeah. So you can actually see very few of the gray people have children, right? Here, yeah, that's right. So these were people who were doing something weird consistently, and it's just a low probability strategy by the classifier that we use. Yeah.
Consider actually being able to turn the knob on selection and then record how long it takes a solution to appear that you find amongst the populations.
Yeah.
So you do something like tournament selection, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You just basically do the selection for the participant, and you could do it with sort of picking the best, and picking a small set.
Yeah, we could control that selection procedure. Yeah, that's
you
right.
control that, and you'll see how long it takes them to learn.
Yeah, although just doing one of these experiments drove us crazy. So, David and then.
So, I mean, the obvious thing to compare it to is what's called herding in game theory. And so you compared this to...
Yeah, we can talk more about it. So basically, we have a lot of results that show that anything which is like chain-like transmission is particularly vulnerable to an influence of inductive bias. Yeah. So again, the point here is this is still not a chain. That's why we have you learning from multiple people in both of those conditions. But even that is not sufficient to allow you to sort of overcome that counterintuitiveness. Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, I get three different people teaching me.
Yeah.
And then presumably what the people are doing, or are they experimenting with all three and then settling on something, or are they just like reading all three, saying these two are crap, I'm just going to
They could be doing either of those.
But you know what? No, but
we don't know what
you
they're
can check that.
Yeah, I mean, we can check, like you can see, in this case we can't see it, but yeah.
You can. But so do you know which one?
So, I mean, I think both of those are happening. I can't tell you the exact numbers. Yeah. Okay, I want to finish up because this is like 2 slides from the end here. Okay, so this is the rest of those random mixing trials, right? And this is the rest of the selective social learning trials. You can see they're very different. It turns out, selection here is necessary in order to get us to the point where they're able to discover these counterintuitive but more effective algorithms, right? And so this tells us at least, one of the protocols that's an effective protocol in this kind of context. To close a loop here, we can actually also sort of think about this in a world where it's not just humans, but also AI systems that are engaging in these processes of cultural transmission, right? This is another, sort of sad loss for humanity against an AI system, right? But the AlphaGo provided this sort of, punctate moment where suddenly there was now a superhuman Go player. And one thing we can actually do is look at, if we take that moment, what happens in terms of the quality of the moves that Go players play, human Go players, and the novelty of the moves that human Go players play. And it actually turns out that the human Go players are trying out all sorts of new strategies as a consequence of the existence of these AI systems. So these are not moves that are played by AlphaGo. These are moves that are generated by humans, and they show both this increase in quality and novelty. So this is sort of maybe one optimistic note about what happens when we include AI in that process of cultural transmission. Okay, so I said, we're going to characterize human computational problems in terms of these constraints. What kind of math do we need for understanding human minds? I've given you some suggestions, right? Bayesian inference meta-learning, resource rationality, distributed computation, evolutionary models are all powerful tools for trying to understand these human characteristics. So I think if we think about the implications for AI here, we shouldn't expect the intelligence produced by machines to look like that of people because they're operating under different constraints, right? But there's an exception to that, which is if you actually have your AI trying to solve the same kinds of problems as people, then you're going to expect it to look more like people, right? So if you're trying to build autonomous, low compute, low bandwidth models, right, then those are the kinds of constraints that human beings operate under. So if you're trying to build something like a space probe that has to go off and operate with very low energy, low bandwidth, and make autonomous decisions, that's a case where the kind of AI you want is maybe much more like what human intelligence is. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn from humans, right? So rapid learning, efficient compute, using language and teaching, they're all nice things to have in our AI system. The difference is that humans need to have them. And so that's the reason why I focused on those as things that are sort of characteristic of human intelligence. Okay, so conclusions. Human computational problems reflect 3 human limitations, potentially distinct from AI: limited time, computation, and communication. Studying those limitations uses formalisms directly relevant to cognitive science, Bayes, resource rationality, distributed computation. And changing the reference class changes how we characterize what is unique about humans. So, I think we can kind of go back to Aristotle, right? So there's nothing necessarily wrong with what Aristotle said. He said animals that think. It's just that I think he emphasized the thinking. And nowadays, when we focus on these kinds of biological constraints, maybe we want to emphasize the animals when we think about what it is that makes humans different from AI, at least. Thank you.